Hello, I'm Loughton, Member of Parliament for East Worthing and Shoreham, and welcome to the final podcast of 2016. And not surprisingly, I'm tackling the subject of our rail service, or our rather shambolic rail service. This continues to be the single biggest issue facing my constituents, and indeed all the MPs in Sussex and those affected by the GTR franchise in the south of England. I continue to get dozens of emails, tweets, Facebook posts every day. Now, there are some people who think that we're not doing anything, we're not doing enough, the government doesn't care, GTR, the management are really doing nothing, and the unions are blameless. Well, let me just make it absolutely clear. This is taking up the major part of my time and every other MP's time. An awful lot has been going on, but the situation remains absolutely dire, and I have absolutely no doubt about the extent of hardship, inconvenience, hassle, stress, cost that this whole situation is having on many thousands, tens of thousands of our constituents, and it's absolutely imperative that this gets sorted as soon as possible, but it's been dragging on for very many months. Now, the immediate problem, we know, is the real disruption being caused by industrial action. Now, I have tried to be even-handed throughout the whole recent months. I've been very critical of the GTR management. Frankly, I think they've handled this whole situation over the last 2 years appallingly. I don't think they're up to running a franchise of this size and this complication. I think their communications are pretty rubbish, and I don't think they've handled the industrial dispute well. I've also been critical of the government, of the Department for Transport, and particularly previous ministers, who I think have not been as engaged in the whole dispute as they could and should have been. Although I do think Chris Grayling, the relatively new Transport Secretary, and Paul Maynard, the new Rail Minister, are much more proactive. And indeed, we've been having meetings with them on at least a weekly basis between the local MPs, and communications are rather better. But there are things they could have done which they haven't done, and in many cases are now being looked at or are going to be done. But the third element in all this, and the most important element in all this at the moment, I'm afraid, are the unions. And the long-running industrial action, unofficial and official, by RMT has caused a huge problem. But the most recent all-out strikes by ASLEF have caused huge disruption. 3 days last week, and we've still got strikes to come after Christmas. I think there is no justification for these strikes, and ASLEF could call them off tomorrow and sit around the table and talk about some specifics of their concerns. That offer has been on the table. Last weekend, there were actually officials, or the weekend before, there were officials from GTR management at ACAS, the Conciliation and Arbitration Service, sitting around a table waiting for ASLEF to turn up, and they didn't. So all this guff about they've been rejected from talks is nonsense. That offer has always been there. Now, let's just remind ourselves what the industrial action is all about. It's because ASLEF and RMT say that there are safety problems by moving across to the new driver-only operated trains. That doesn't mean there's only going to be one person, the driver, on the train. It means they're going to be a driver, and he or she will be pressing that button which opens and shuts the doors. That happens up and down the country in over a third of our other train networks, and has done since the 1980s. It's the normal practice in trains across the continent and other parts of the world. The conductor who currently carries out that function on southern trains will still be on the train, will still be trained to the regulation safety standards, will be renamed a customer supervisor, and will be joined by additional customer supervisors. There's over 100 of them that have been trained up who will be starting and working on trains in the new year. So there are actually been more staff on board many of these trains, there to help customers, to help people on and off passengers, particularly platforms, particularly those with disabilities who are having problems now. The Office of the Rail Safety Regulator says there is not a safety issue about changing over to having the doors operated in this way. There is no evidence to show that a greater risk of operating trains in this way. And if there was, Why are ASLEF drivers operating trains on a driver-only operated basis and have been doing for years? So the nonsense was last week, on the same day that ASLEF instructed its members to go on strike and not run southern trains between Brighton and London, there were other ASLEF affiliated drivers driving trains, operating the doors on driver-only operated trains, running between Bedford, London and Brighton on the very same lines, stopping at the very same stations. It's a complete nonsense. This strike is a fraud. Safety is a complete red herring. And if the unions really, and it's the militant union management, not the ordinary members, if they really cared a fig about the passengers whose lives are being wrecked, they would sit down and discuss a way forward and try and find solutions rather than being so entrenched saying we're just not having it. Now I raised this at Prime Minister's Question Time just last Wednesday with the Prime Minister and threw up this clear anomaly where ASLEF are saying one thing on one hand but actually doing the opposite on the other. So the first thing that needs to happen is let's suspend the strikes and let's talk about ways forward. There are some legitimate safety considerations where cameras are not operating properly. There are specific challenges at certain railway stations. Let's talk about that, and I'm sure some changes can be made. But so far 155 stations in the south have all been inspected and all been cleared that it's perfectly safe to use driver-only operated trains. Now another thing that's been happening, as I say, we've been having weekly meetings with Chris Grayling and Paul Maynard, the Rail Minister. Yesterday 23 MPs from Sussex and the South met the Prime Minister, who was summoned to her office, which shows that this whole issue is being taken very seriously at the very highest level. She left us in absolutely no doubt that it's a priority for her to get this sorted out. We need to take action to persuade the unions to drop this action, and if we can't, then we need to take action to make sure that these strikes are causing as little inconvenience as possible. So measures are being looked at and will be enforced soon, I hope, about replacement bus services. I've said we should draft in the army to be driving some of these buses. We've done it in other strikes before when there's a central service that is disrupting people's lives at stake. Also talking about using public buildings for making transport easy alternative transport. We should be busing people to use other rail networks close by. Last week, for example, I had to be in Tunbridge Wells in the afternoon. I had to come up to Westminster in the morning. I drove across to Tunbridge Wells very easily. I got onto a platform. I got onto a southeast train within minutes. Lots of spare seats. Arrived 1 minute late at Cannon Street. Big apologies from the conductor. It worked very well. Let's start using those other available services to alleviate the immediate effects of this strike. Now, all these sorts of things were talked about with the Prime Minister yesterday, and I think we're going to see some concerted action over the next few weeks if this strike continues. And as I say, it doesn't need to continue. The unions could suspend that action and talk now. I also yesterday, with a small group of Sussex MPs, met Charles Horton, the head of GTR again, and I'm afraid it is frustrating. I know what a difficult time they are having, but their communications are poor, and we made a number of suggestions to them as how they need to be much more customer friendly and customer focused, and they need to realise that it's the passengers who are really suffering here, and they're just not seen to be taking this as seriously as they should. They're not seen to be acting urgently, and they need to do a lot more. So we gave him a serious frank and full exchange of views, as they call it. And then today is the last day Parliament sits before the Christmas recess, and I've introduced what's called a 10-minute rule bill. And this is all about compensation and the Ombudsman. Now, many people say to me, look, we're not really interested in compensation. What we want is a reliable train service, so we can turn up at the station and get on a train to go to work, to go to school, to go to college, to go to hospital appointments, and get back home and see our families at roughly the sort of time we expected to do that. That's the most important thing. I get that, I see that, absolutely. But actually, the way the compensation system works at the moment doesn't mitigate in favour of running a reliable service. At the moment, only about a third of people who could claim compensation for delayed trains, cancelled trains and others actually claim that compensation. It's not a particularly generous compensation system either. You get 25% if you have the delay repay 15 minutes But certainly for people who are having to stay in London overnight now to be able to get to work, people find themselves stranded at Three Bridges Station late at night because the trains pack up and they get a taxi back down to the south coast. These are serious costs involved. And actually the way the compensation system works is that most of the faults, about 60%, are down to network rail because of points failures and infrastructure problems rather than the train operator themselves. And network rail pays compensation to the train operator, but only a fraction of that then actually gets paid out to the passenger, and there's no legal requirement for them to pay that out. I think that's a nonsense. So what I'm suggesting instead is in the future, every time a train is delayed beyond a certain threshold, it's cancelled altogether, or it overruns station, doesn't stop at stations, then there will be a tariff of penalties which the train operator, GTR, automatically will pay into a pot independent of that company. It's then up to passengers who have suffered inconvenience and cost to claim in a much more simplified system. And I met a company last week that actually has developed an app where you can download it, where you can turn up at the station, you will be GPS located, it will show them when the train failed to do what it should have done. That will trigger a compensation claim, will be lodged automatically, and you'll receive a refund in your bank account without having to do any paperwork. I think that would speed things up and cut down on the bureaucracy hugely. And so that money would automatically be paid out to those passengers who deserved it and qualified for it. Secondly, money from that pot would be used to set up a new ombudsman. And thirdly, any money left in the pot would then be set against any fare price rises coming through. An extra payback for passengers subject to all this inconvenience. I think that way there will be a real incentive for a train operating company, be it GTR or others, actually to get their act together. Otherwise they're going to hemorrhage millions of pounds regardless of whether passengers actually go to the trouble of claiming it or not. And the second part of my private members bill is to set up an ombudsman. Incredibly, there is not a proper ombudsman system for the rail industry now that has teeth, and we need one. And my campaign for this has been backed by the consumer watchdog Which, who has been campaigning for a proper ombudsman. That ombudsman would have the power to take up individual complaints, to direct the company to pay proper compensation if required, then to look at bigger problems that are causing greater complaints on the train network, to give that information to government to be able to make changes to franchises in the way that the rail service works. It would have real teeth, would be on a statutory basis, and would actually be on the passenger's side. Now, all of that is not a silver bullet to resolve the problems in the rail industry, and it's certainly not a silver bullet to get GTR back to some form of normal working now, but I think it would certainly help, and it would recalibrate the whole way that the rail system works at the moment, which is not in the interest of passengers when things go wrong. So all I wanted to say is there's an awful lot that has been going on. I know it's frustrating, I know the huge hassle that people are being faced with. People are losing their jobs. We're told about employers who will refuse to interview people who rely on a Southern train service simply because they don't think they'll be reliable. People's family lives are being put to huge stress and hassle, and I get all that, and it's completely unacceptable. So we are working as hard as we can to resolve this situation. It will help if the unions, to start with, suspended their strike action and got back round the table. In the new year, we're going to see these new on-train supervisors coming on board. I think that will partly help the situation. I think also we need to look at rejigging the whole franchise with GTR. It's too big, they're not up to managing the thing. But the problem is, who else will take all or part of it on? Because Virgin and other train operators are not queuing up to say we can run it, given this is a bit of a poison chalice, and the Department for Transport certainly isn't up to running it either. We need a new compensation scheme, we need a new ombudsman, and I know the government and the minister are sympathetic to that, and I think we'll see some progress with that in the new year. We need to see the £20 million which the government has been putting into hotspots to sort out some of these areas that are constantly causing delays and hold-ups on the road. All these things need to come together, more practical measures to show that the government is on top of trying to be on the side of passengers in this wholly unnecessary and unjustified strike action. I will continue to update the section on my website and post things on Twitter and Facebook and in my newsletter, but I just wanted to give this the latest update to show what has been happening just in the last week, and this is being taken very seriously at the very highest levels, frustrating though it is that this disruption goes on. At least if you're at home over Christmas, you won't have the stress of the trains or the lack of them, but I do hope you have a happy Christmas and we can all look forward to a peaceful new year, and one where we can at last rely on efficient train service that we should have had before now and we all deserve. Thank you very much.